Good evening and welcome. My name is Britt Oates, Manager of Public Programs at Planet Word, and it is a pleasure to welcome you all to our virtual program. If you don't know, Planet Word is the only museum in the country dedicated to renewing and inspiring a love of words, language, and reading. And it's because of the generous donations of folks like you all in attendance this evening that makes free programs such as tonight's possible. So please consider donating and support our efforts to continue to produce impactful and accessible programs like this one and more. Tonight's program will include a compelling discussion between two outstanding scholars, psycholinguist Julie Sedivy and reading and language science expert Maryanne Wolf as they talk about Julie's latest book, Linguaphile, A Life of Language Love, a memoir, and ruminate on, as Julie has mentioned, what it means to be a linguistic creature. Now, let's go ahead and introduce our esteemed guests. Julie Sedivy is a hybrid academic and writer who is obsessed with language in all its facets. She has taught linguistics and psychology at Brown University and the University of Calgary. She is the author of Memory Speaks, On Losing and Reclaiming Language, and Self and Language in Mind, an introduction to psycholinguistics. And as mentioned previously, we are so thrilled to welcome Julie to discuss her latest book, Linguaphile, A Life of Language Love. Maryanne Wolf is a scholar, a teacher, and an advocate for children and literacy around the world. She is the director of the newly created Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. She is the author of Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain, Dyslexia, Fluency, and the Brain, Tales of Literacy for the 21st Century, and Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World. Now, to get the discussion started, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Julie Sedivy.
Hello. Thank you so much, Britt and Planet Word. And thank you, Maryanne, for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you. So what I'm going to do is I'll start by saying a little bit about how the book came to be and an overview of some of its main themes. And then I'll read a short excerpt, and then we can launch into a conversation that I've been eagerly awaiting for some time. So I have to tell you that I actually became a language scientist almost entirely by accident. I started my university days as an English major with the intention of becoming a writer. And one day, as I was browsing the course catalog, I came across a course called Linguistics. And it occurred to me that that might be useful for a writer to know something about. So I signed up for the class. And from the first day, I was completely transfixed. It had never occurred to me that you could study language, this object that I loved, with such precision and rigor, and with a way of excavating such depth of insight that was really not accessible to me in other ways. So that resulted in a very abrupt career change at that point. I dropped my English major, went on to do a PhD in linguistics. And so I was a little bit distressed when early in my teaching career, I had a student come up to me at the end of my very first lecture of the semester. And she told me that she was not going to be continuing in the class. And by way of explanation, she said, "You see, I'm a poet. And so I'm not interested in dissecting language the way we seem to be doing in this course." And I was so taken aback because, of course, that was very different from my reaction to encountering linguistics. But also, I felt that if I'm not connecting with the poets, what am I doing wrong as a teacher? So that interaction stayed with me for a very long time. And as I started thinking about writing this book, I really wanted to write this book for her or students like her, in a way that didn't just summarize or describe some of the interesting findings of linguistics, but that really embodied my relationship to language. And that gave some sense of the richness of how language and how rich the world, in fact, looks when seen through the lens of this deeper understanding. So I often tell people that I set out to write a book about language, and I ended up writing a book about love and about time.
Mm-hmm.
I think that language and love spring from the same very deep human impulse to connect with each other, to share our inner worlds and mental states. So if you think of how a baby learns language, it's so different from how a chatbot learns language. We often talk about how ChatGPT learns by ingesting enormous quantities of language. But when it comes to babies, I think it would be more accurate to say that instead of learning by ingesting or receiving language, they learn from seeking language in interactions with other humans. So maybe you've had this experience of being on a crowded bus or train, and all the adults are staring down at their phones. And then someone's got a 4-month-old baby. And that baby is just scanning all the faces, looking for someone to lock eyes with. And if you give them your eyes, they'll let you know that you're the most fascinating creature in the universe. And they might vocalize. And then if you say something back, they'll reward you with a big grin, or they might do this with their limbs in excitement. And then a little conversation ensues. And we know that when children learn a new word, they're not just making statistical associations between words and things in the world, but that they have a deep understanding that language is for joining attention. So there's this very well-known experiment that I think illustrates this beautifully. So think of an experimenter in a room with a toddler. The experimenter gives the child a toy, some new unfamiliar toy, and the child is playing with it, utterly fascinated by it. And the experimenter says, "It's a Modi." Mm-hmm. And you might think that the child assumes that Modi refers to the thing that's in its center of attention at the moment that the word is being uttered. But that's in fact not what happens. What happens is that the baby looks at the speaker, notices that that person is looking inside a bucket at something that's hidden from the child. The child reaches for it, takes it out, and then later, when tested, shows that they've applied the word Modi to that object in the bucket instead of the thing that they were staring at the time that the word was uttered. In other words, they're showing that they understand that when people say something, it's because they're trying to share something that has caught their own attention. And that's, I think, a very deep level of understanding of what language is for. We have so much evidence that language learning is intimate and really deeply social. Mm-hmm. We know that babies learn better from live interactions with people than they do from audio or even video recordings. We know that reciprocal dance of conversation is at least as important as the sheer quantity of language that children are exposed to. And we know that children learn words more readily from people that they know and trust than they do from strangers or someone who's shown that they can be misleading in their use of language. So that sense of trust is really important. So I think that when we talk about language, we don't always acknowledge how deeply relational language is and how it requires such finely honed social skills in order for us to learn it and then continue to use it throughout our lives. So I'm hoping that we get to talk about that a little bit. As for time, I think that spoken language especially is shaped by its relationship to time, a little bit like a way a bird's body is shaped by its relationship to gravity, as something that it's constantly having to resist. So in spoken language, we're constantly under time pressure because speech is evanescent in nature. It disappears into the past as soon as it's been uttered. And that means that we have to rely on our memory to hold on to language that has already vanished into the past. So think about someone uttering a random stream of numbers that you're trying to remember. You very quickly realize that beyond 4 or 6 numbers, your capacity to remember them just falls apart. So when we understand a sentence, we're not accumulating all the words in memory before extracting meaning from them. Instead, we're doing something much more active and much more frantic, I think. We're immediately trying to group them together, pull meaning out of them any way we can before they fade from memory. And we're constantly generating predictions about what we think is coming next. And sometimes we jump the gun and make errors. So there are often cracks to our understanding. And time is even more unforgiving when we're speaking because speaking is even more cognitively demanding than listening. So that results in speech errors, disfluencies, and all kinds of things that we might think of as flaws or failures of language. And I've learned that the places where language fails and the ways that we rescue these failures is what has often given scientists much of their insight about how language works in the mind. And I think that much of what happens in language is about how time constraints meet up with our capacity for alignment. So love meets time, and that our attunement to each other is often what rescues us from the limitations of time pressures. So in the book, I wrote about a number of examples, but let me pull out just one. So we often read much more meaning into an utterance than what has actually been said. Often we're reading between the lines of language. So if someone says, the bridge collapsed, the wood was rotten, you don't need that person to say, the bridge collapsed because the wood from which it was made was rotten. All of that extra stuff can be left implicit because the hearer knows that you wouldn't just stick two sentences together if there wasn't some connection between them, and they infer what that connection is. And the speaker relies on their knowledge that the hearer can do this. Or if someone asks you after today, so how was the book talk at Planet Word? And you say, well, Julie has a rather pleasant voice. I guarantee that that person will be generating an awful lot more meaning than what has been packed into those words. So on that note, I'd like to read an excerpt from the book, from the opening pages of a chapter I call Crevasses. And this chapter really focuses a lot on the way we read between the lines and on the responsibility we have to each other for attunement and for the possible misinterpretations and dangers we can fall into if we fail to align properly with each other. And as I wrote the book, I decided to also write it in a way that requires the reader to do a bit of reading between the lines and make inferences about the author's intended meaning. So you may find that you're doing some active interpretation while you hear me read. When I was 12, I asked my mother if I was pretty. She looked at me and considered. It's more important to be smart than to be pretty, she said. This exchange is an apt summary of our relationship at the time. I spent my adolescence convinced that I was ugly. Not for me was the shelter of a mother's admiring gaze. No reassuring words to make me over and conceal my blemishes. I faced the world raw skin out. It was a world that appeared to teem with girls skilled in the arts of lip gloss and contouring, girls who knew how to compose themselves inside their clothing, how to angle a shoulder or a hip, how to liquefy their movements, who steered the gaze of boys in their direction and were happy about it. Girls who appraised and ranked other girls. Girls, I was convinced, who knew their mothers thought they were beautiful. Many years later, my husband, who did think me beautiful, prepared me for a day of walking on a glacier. Though it was summer, snow covered much of the ice, and one had to be aware of the treachery underfoot. It was possible, while walking, to punch right through the thin snow and drop down into a crevasse, a deep crack that had opened up some time ago as the glacier moved over uneven terrain. Once inside, it would be futile to try to scale its vertical walls, as uncompromising as glass. Mountaineering magazines offer dire accounts of climbers or skiers who have fallen to their deaths in these great fissures, their bodies at times washed away by the torrents of ice water that run through a glacier's arteries. These are the words that I heard that my mother did not say. Well, I can't lie to you and say you are pretty because you are not, but really you should stop obsessing about this foolish question because it's more important to be smart than to be pretty. Language, too, has many crevasses. Its surface appears trustworthy, as if one can rely on solid meaning underfoot. But between the words, there are unseen gaps. As I grew older, it became clear to me that people often did not say what they meant, nor meant what they said. My mother, leaning into the bowels of the grimy stove she was scrubbing, muttered through gritted teeth to an unseen someone, "Thank you very much. I'm so eternally grateful for this work." One day I brought home my report card, proudly showing my father the 97% I'd been awarded in 7th grade English. His eyes crinkled at the corners, but then he said, uttering a question that I thought only he could ask, but that I have since learned is the universal question of immigrant parents everywhere: where did the other 3 points go?
I love that.
How could I answer? What did he mean by this? Was I meant to reflect on what I had done to squander those percentage points, which were rightfully mine? Was I being warned of the dangers of a bloated sense of self? Was it a reminder that academic perfection was the only fair trade in exchange for my parents' sacrifices? Mm-hmm. What I think now is that he was attempting to say, but did not, "Daughter, you fill me with pride." Mm-hmm. What we understand as meaning, then, is really a calculation of what has been said against other possible ways of saying. I once heard a friend refer to her mother as the woman who ejected me from her uterus. I understood this to be a renunciation of her female parent, a declaration that the woman had no right to claim all the imagined meanings that are spring-loaded inside the word mother, the word that my friend could not, it seemed, bring herself to say. Between reasonable people, a sumptuous conversation can unfold despite an austerity of language. An intelligent hearer enlarges meanings against an appraisal of what might have been said but was not. A cooperative speaker foresees the hearer's construal and avoids leading her into a crevasse. Still, there are many opportunities for falls, ranging from benign to deadly. Our imagined meanings are only as solid as our theories of other people. We build these up over time, depositing layers of knowledge into the gaps left by language. Knowledge of other humans, what they know, what they desire, how they wield language to achieve those desires. Knowledge of the customs that dictate which words may or may not be used. Knowledge of the intimate details of the present situation, and of how all these forces have come bearing down on the speaker at this very moment. And only once many layers have been packed down into a firm mass is it safe to take a step.
Beautiful.
So I thought maybe we could start, Maryanne, by you've written so much about reading. And I know that you think about time as well. And I wonder if maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the differences between spoken and written language in terms of how they relate to time, and maybe what each offers that the other doesn't have to offer.
Julie, before I do, I can't help myself but tell you and others that we who look at language in two of its magnificent aspects had a very similar set of epiphanies that led us into our study. I too had 2 degrees in English literature, the second being on the poetry of Rilke, before I had the insight, due to some social circumstances, teaching in a Peace Corps like place setting where I understood the political, economic, social, emotional consequences of not becoming literate, and also a course by Chomsky, but not Noam,
Oh,
Carol.
Carol.
Carol Chomsky. I took courses from Noam, but it was Carol Chomsky's course on psycholinguistics, developmental psycholinguistics, that, like you, led me from the love of word to the science of words. So we're very, very similar.
So
But
wonderful. So this is validation
this
that
is
language
total.
science also for poets and lovers of literature.
Exactly. And so I want to answer or begin to answer your question by beginning with a poem that I have always kept half memorized from Adrienne Rich's book, The Dream of a Common Language. And she had this one, it was called Cartography of Silence, I believe is the title. But it was each conversation begins with the lie, and each speaker of the so-called common language feels the ice flow split, drift apart. And then it goes on to say, a poem can begin with the lie and be torn up. A conversation has other laws, cannot be torn up. And then she ends, and this is where my memory is I tried to look it up, but it's like, and yet each time I move from an envy of the enunciation of the I, which is my work, reading, to these thoughts, these words, these conversations from which the truth breaks forth fresh and green. And I just loved that poem, and that whole work of poetry, because it really was a testimony both to the power of the conversation, the alignment with love, and also to the ability of written language to preserve it in time.
Yeah.
And that's where I think if I would talk about the differences and how time works, and then you used a very beautiful expression in your book about the role of solitude in reading.
Mhm.
And as you know, and Britt said, my first book was called Proust and the Squid, because Proust said that the language is so miraculous because in the midst of solitude can come a communication between two people. And I don't want to paraphrase everybody like like Proust and Audrey, but what was being said was that this generative aspect of language, this generative aspect of language can take place, even though it's like a conversation between author and reader, in solitude, which allows you to go outside of time. And for me, and I'll just say one more thing, and then I want to turn this back to you, is this role of time, the allocation of the brain's attentional system to the rest of the reading circuit is dependent upon time. And you and I have both written in our different ways about our worry that in a digital world, time goes out of the equation, that we are not giving time to what I would call deep reading, that deep reading requires time, requires the activation or the connection from background knowledge to empathy. Again, Proust, passing over into the perspective of others and coming back enriched. Very importantly, critical thinking. And all of that's the penultimate set of processes leading to the rare but ultimate goal of written language, which is to give reflection. And
Yes.
that's where I will use Proust. He said, the heart of reading is when we go beyond the wisdom of the author to discover our own. And that takes time. And I would say that written language, the most incredible aspect of written language is that it gives us this kind of time for immersion that will, when we're very fortunate, lead to novel thought, our own insights, our own epiphanies.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I remember someone telling me with some excitement that they had come across an app that presents that you can feed in a text and it will present the text to you one word at a time at the desired speed.
Speed,
So that
yes.
it's a way to basically ramp yourself up to read something more quickly than you otherwise might be inclined to do. And I just thought, if you do that, you are giving up all of the advantages of text, which is that you have agency over the passage of time in a way that you don't have with speech. And that's what this technology has to offer us exactly, is that room to reread, to think about, to respond to the author, so that you're not just passively being shaped by the text, but you are actually creating something of yourself in response to the text. So I couldn't agree more. And that really resonated for me in the way that you read about it in Read or Come Home, the importance of that and of appreciating that. And I also felt a little bit that much as we're in danger of losing, I think, some of the richness that text has to offer, uh, I think we often don't appreciate some of what conversation has to offer, which is very different from text.
Yes.
And because it's constrained by time, if you observe people really having a conversation, as opposed to a performance, so much of what might seem might have the element of a performance. You take your turn, I take my turn. But if you watch people in a coffee shop just talking, there's so much interaction that's happening, overlapping, interjection. Uh, and this is in the service of constructing meaning that is difficult to produce in real time. So sometimes a speaker might take a shortcut and say, so that annoying coworker, what he did this week? And the other person will interrupt and say, oh, you mean that guy that sent you the creepy email? And then the conversation continues. And there's this back and forth of, I'm checking that you understand me. I'm verifying that I understand you, or giving you signals that I don't, giving you interjections and guiding the conversation. So all of these subtle cues that we use as a way of really collaborating in a conversation. These are skills of attunement that we don't learn unless we have ample opportunity for face-to-face real-time conversation. And I think we often underappreciate that because it's a little bit less flashy than the wonderful feats, the dazzling feats of language that you see in poetry or literature. These are more like dazzling feats of connection. And I think we know when we have a conversation like that, we come away from a truly connected conversation feeling so nourished, because just like that, story of locking eyes with the baby on the bus, we feel that we have been given someone's full attention and responsiveness. And I think that is something that we as humans just absolutely need.
I want to say that what I am doing right now is an example of what the conversation is. I'm going to literally take what you're saying, activate my thoughts to yours, and align them. And I thought what you in your book made so clear to me, and that I hadn't thought of with reading, was that this is an instantaneous set of literally changing our thinking, our perspective. If we're in a true conversation, the kind that Audrey Rich is talking about, if we're in a true conversation, it's almost like Piaget, we are accommodating to this other perspective.
Yes.
What I've always loved about reading, but which I think is personified more quickly in conversation is that you are passing over to that perspective, taking it on, and you're changing your own so that you are sharing. That's what I think the dream of a common language, language having this commonality, this ability to connect,
Yeah.
only Forster, only connect. And I think conversation does that in a way that sometimes reading tries, or the act of writing tries. And as you know, I wrote Reader Come Home as a set of letters,
Mm-hmm.
in part because I wanted to at least suggest to the reader that I wish we could have had this conversation. I wish and hope that they will bring their background knowledge to understand this perspective. But what is what I never thought about till I read your book and involved us in this conversation now twice, is that with reading, you don't have the same opportunity to change quickly,
Yeah.
to align, that you hope, the author hopes to bring these thoughts to the reader, but you don't know.
You
You
don't
have
know.
no ability to know what that reader is
Yeah.
actually thinking of.
Exactly. And you're going blind, right? In a
Yes, going
conversation,
blind.
all these cues about whether they're following you. I mean, even if you're giving a talk in a room, you have that sense of when you're losing the audience, when they're getting restless, when to do something different, when to change. When you're writing, of course, it's just blank. There's a void that you're speaking into.
Right.
The great advantage, of course, is that you have the time to revisit your language. So
Yes.
when I was working on Linguaphile, I counted it as a good day if I could generate 500 words that I was happy with over the course of an entire day devoted to writing.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's what, like two
It's
or
true.
3 minutes of speech, right?
Yes.
In terms
Yes.
of word count.
Yes.
Um, so just endless turning over, thinking about
Mhm.
alternative ways of saying, really trying to imagine how the words would land on the reader.
Yes.
So it's just a very different way of using language. And one thing that really struck me when I was reading Reader Come Home, you make a plea for us to develop multiple modes of using language.
Mhm.
And what you talk about is the digital mode versus the
Mhm.
text reading mode.
Mhm.
Um, and that really stuck with me. And I think that could apply to spoken and written language as well, that
Mhm.
these are different modes. They have
Mhm.
different things to offer.
Mhm.
And if we understand a little bit more about what each has to offer,
Mhm.
maybe we can take a little bit of agency in our decisions as to when we seek out something in spoken language and when we seek it out in writing.
Mhm. I think there's also something, and I'm going to pose this not so much as a question, but a way that we can both share our thoughts about this intersection of oral and written language. And I'll use Charles Taylor, the philosopher, who really, who said all these amazing things about how language exists as the way, as a drive. Oh, and I wrote this wonderful word that you use,
Hmm.
Pupowi, from
Yeah.
Potawatomi. I
Yeah.
love this word because you were talking about the drive that you use mushrooms, that mushrooms are suddenly appearing out of the earth.
Yeah.
Well, what Charles Taylor was trying to say is that to possess a language is to be continuously trying to match what I think Herder, but he did too, match everything felt by the soul with sound.
Yeah.
And that is what I believe, this drive. How do you pronounce this word? Papoe? Papoe?
I've tried to find the pronunciation and I'm unsure. So
Oh,
yeah.
well, whatever that word is, I believe that connects oral and written language. The drive to articulate in a conversation, the drive to find, as Italo Calvino said, the mot juste, the perfect word that expresses that complex nest of thoughts, and conversation can, between people who are really eliciting the best thoughts of each other. I believe that does it. And then at our best, when we write, and I can tell that you do this 500 word, I do something equivalent, one perfect paragraph a day, please, and then I'm happy. But it's never perfect. But the idea is that it takes that long in written language sometimes to find that as close to an approximation of our best thoughts as we could give.
Yeah.
But writing gives us a chance,
Yeah.
as Audrey and Rich said, we can tear it up, we can
Yeah.
refine, we can
Mhm.
edit, and we can find ever more perfect approximations.
Yeah.
But we're never there.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what
You
I
know,
think we share too. We're never there.
yeah, absolutely. I'm reminded too of what Joan Didion wrote when she said, I write to understand what I think, or
I
to
think. Yes.
discover what I think. And I think in that process of formulating language, in writing, you just have more time to dig into that discovery. But I think this is true of conversation as well, in that practice of fumbling to give some shape to these nebulous thoughts and feelings that you have and express them, that in that journey, there's a tremendous amount of learning and discovery that is happening. In conversation, you're doing that with the help of another person.
Mm-hmm.
Might suggest ways of expression that you hadn't thought about, and that has its own beauty and pleasure, I think. But yeah.
But you as a writer do that in your writing. I have to say, I literally wrote down this quote that is just, to me, the one of the best ways of talking about how this happens in childhood. Some thoughts remain nebulous until they are fixed in language. I loved that. I can't wait to give your book to my son and daughter-in-law who just had their first child, my first grandchild. And I want to give them, because that thought alone is what I think connects oral and written language.
Yeah.
Language fixes thoughts and gives us almost the foundation for thought after thought after thought. Like Vygotsky said, thought and language, it's coming together.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
so generative. It's so
yeah,
generative. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Mhm.
Oh, what was it? I love this one quote from Toni Morrison. And here what we're doing, we're giving the thoughts to each other in conversation that made an imprint on our heart from a writer. And this was Toni Morrison. And she said, word work, like you do, word work is sublime because it is generative.
Yeah.
We die, and that may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our life. And I thought that connects us.
Yeah, it's so wonderful that you pulled up that quote, because that almost made it into my book.
Ah,
In the end, find a spot for it, but that is a quote that sits on my heart a lot.
yes, exactly.
So now, knowing a little bit about your background, I'm curious to know whether, I'm guessing I know the answer to this, but I'd love to hear you talk about it, is whether knowing something about the science of language has enhanced your appreciation for it, your sense of pleasure in language. Has it had that effect for you?
There are two categories. One is the appreciation of the utter complexity of the brain circuitry for language that is then
Yeah.
used with new circuits for the reading brain circuitry. So the appreciation of that just has been almost epiphanous for me. Just that's what lies underneath our ability to retrieve a word. Just as a side thought, and then I'm going to say one other thought. My kids, my sons who are grown, have always said, Mom, you did a whole dissertation on how people retrieve a single word. Did you ever find out?
What did you say?
No,
Oh,
no, no, but I learned a lot along the way.
I
And
have
that's
better
how,
questions now.
and that set of questions about how the brain retrieves a single word led to everything that I do in education,
Mhm.
to and built a program called Ravo based on how we retrieve words in the brain. So a whole program for dyslexia came out of my discovery what we do when we retrieve words. Oh, I have to tell you one small thing. One member of the audience is Catherine Donnelly Adams, who wrote me immediately before. She teaches at Penn State. She said she couldn't wait for this dialogue, Julie, because her students have your psycholinguistic textbook and my reader come home. And
Oh, wonderful.
she couldn't believe that the two authors that her students read are coming together today.
Perfect.
But anyway, she is part of the science of reading. And so the science is both appreciation of complexity, to answer your question more succinctly, and it has germinated an entire way that we can help children whose retrieval of words in sometimes orally, but more often in terms of written language, that has helped me combine knowledge to make something for children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, I think one of the things that has happened is that by virtue of just the close scrutiny of language that you go through as part of a linguistics training, just sharpened my attention to language in a way that even writing and reading a lot do to the same extent. So there's something about sitting in a lab and listening to many, many sounds of many different languages, and of knowing how those sounds are shaped in the mouth, how they relate to each other in patterns, that just makes you more attuned. And I found that I started to read poetry differently.
Ah, yes.
A deeper sense of awareness of the sound patterns and structure and the mouth feel of words.
Yes.
And that just, at a very sensory level, really enhanced my pleasure of it. And syntax too, just knowing more about how sentences are put together gives you a sense of the bones of language. In I think much the same way that the old masters used to study anatomy in order to be able to draw and paint human figures. There's something about studying the anatomy of syntax that now when I read sentences that are just do something extraordinary, I feel that extra bit of pleasure from that. So highly recommend it as an area study.
I want to give you one tiny example, which you gave me even a further example. And this has just been so delightful because you spur thoughts in me that reinforce and propel my own thinking. So one of the beauties in the study of language is actually from the study of semantic activation. And I love to teach teachers, and Catherine, if she's listening, will understand. I love to teach them polysemy, that a word has not, just one meaning, but it has multiple meanings. And you use Maryanne Wolf's quote that a word should not be, I won't paraphrase it, but she said something like, a word can have one useful meaning. I think she says, we can go catch a train. But she said, but to restrict it to that means that the word will fold its wings and die. I'm like, that's what I want children to know. The polysemous nature comes from the science to the appreciation of beauty of language, underlying all that lies beneath words, and to how we teach our children.
Yeah, and I loved encountering that quote from Maryanne Wolf because
it's great.
Just such an attunement to language. And then you kind of see it and go like, oh yeah. And now we have countless psycholinguistic experiments that show exactly what she was talking about.
Exactly.
So Maryanne, I feel like I could talk to you for many, many hours, and I hope that we do have a chance to talk for many hours, but it looks like it's time to turn this over to a Q&A and see what the audience is curious to hear about. So Marilyn says, fascinating approach, Julie. With my firstborn grandchild, I have the time to observe how he has learned languages, just as you describe, with love and for meaning. Theo, now 3, started with English, then Spanish, and soon after Chinese. Wonderful. Hooray! However, now 3.5, he has started preschool and has lost Chinese. My question, what is the secret? what is the procedure to help him retain his potential
Mm,
bilingualness? My apologies, I need to leave for a concert before the end of the seminar. Okay, so hopefully Marilyn can listen to the recording after the fact.
mhm,
Um, this is a question that's so near to my heart because actually I was in Theo's shoes. I learned Czech first and then came across several other languages, and started to lose my mother tongue of Czech. And I actually wrote a book about this very issue called Memory Speaks. This is a struggle that immigrants everywhere have, or anybody who moves from one language environment to another, the challenge of retaining a language that's in the minority. And there's no quick fix to it. It really takes a tremendous amount of commitment and dedication on the part of the family to help a child retain that language. It helps enormously if the child has access to a community outside the family that speaks that language. So I know that when I was a small child, I observed very quickly that my Czech language was not valued outside of the family home. You pick up on that as a kid very, very easily. And had I been in a broader community where it was clear that people did value speaking that language, where I had the opportunity to become literate in it to a deeper level than I was, that would have helped a lot. But yeah, it's with commitment, repeated connections, maintaining connections. People who travel to the country of that where that language is spoken generally have an easier time maintaining their connection to that language. So I wish you well. But I will also say that sometimes when it looks like a child has lost a language, there's still something there that's retained.
mhm,
And
mhm.
once you re-immerse them in that environment, they can pick it up rather quickly. So don't lose heart that just because Theo seems to be speaking less Chinese, that he has lost everything. That's probably not the case.
Mhm.
Do you have anything to add, Maryanne? Do you have any experience with this issue?
I would just say that what you said also refers to bidialecticalism. And I've learned a great deal from a Tufts professor in language, Chip Kidney, who spoke that he had grown up in Washington, D.C., where only standard American English was spoken. And then when he went to high school, he realized this whole world of a different dialect. Um, uh, as we know in English, there's no superiority of one dialect to another, and both are dialects. But he had to learn this other form of English, African American English. And it was so interesting for me to hear him talk in terms of how do we teach our children different dialects too, um, along with what you said. It's
Yeah,
difficult but important.
including the value of the dialect, because that's
Exactly correct.
something that children learn very quickly, that some dialects are devalued compared to others.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, here's an interesting question. How do
Mm.
you predict language will change throughout the next several decades?
Mm.
um, hmm. I hate making predictions. Do you want to hazard any?
And risk being Cassandra.
Mhm.
Uh, I guess what I would say is the past is always a good way of thinking, how can we learn from history of language for looking towards the future without so much predicting as knowing that language is evolving, always changing, always moving, and that even a look at the last 5 or 10 years of the new words that have become so common in our language is a way of looking and enjoying how words are formed because of our environmental the nurturance of our environment on language as well as the nurturance of our language on environment. So when you think about if we would look at our text messages, for example, all the acronyms that have now become almost a word, BTW, yeah, just as a joke, my sons thought my book should be called TL DR.
Too
Too
long,
long,
didn't
didn't
read.
read.
Oh
So,
no.
that there's all kinds of ways that language has this organicity that I believe is wonderful. So I won't predict, but I will say that historically, that's who we are. We are an evolving
With
species. Our words evolve with us.
yeah, and with many influences coming in. One of the things I do think about a fair bit now is what will happen to our language capacities as we interact with new forms of technology.
Exactly.
So one of the things that the new chatbots are doing, the new AI models are doing, is in a way they're blurring a bit some of the properties of spoken and written language.
Mm-hmm.
So the input to many of these models is largely written language. It's
Mm-hmm.
spoken language is fed into them as well, but much of it is text-based,
Mm-hmm.
which has a different quality, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but also, even if you interact with a spoken version of a chatbot, there's something very misleading about it in that humans in conversation are constrained by time in the way that we discussed, and chatbots are not.
Mm-hmm.
They have massive computational power. They don't run into the same under the same constraints that we do.
Mm-hmm.
But because they suck up human speech as part of their training data, they mimic the way
Mm-hmm.
the humans speak. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, for example, of the case of disfluencies as being a really interesting example. So it turns out that when people insert disfluencies in their speech, they tend to do it at places where the planning is really difficult. So
Yes.
they've kind of stalled out because they've started uttering the sentence and then they've hit a part of the sentence where it's hard to find the right word or the sentence structure is a bit complex. And that's where you tend to see the disfluencies.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, this actually helps the listener to understand the sentence.
Yes.
So this
Yes.
is, I think, one of those beautiful examples of how
Mm-hmm.
alignment to each other comes to the rescue,
Mm-hmm.
because the listener has an implicit model of what the speaker is doing when they try to speak and
Mm-hmm.
understands that there's a
Mm-hmm.
discrepancy here because some complexity is coming up. So
Mm-hmm.
they're now tuned for something more complex.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really curious as to what happens in a situation where you're interacting with a machine that
Mm-hmm.
does insert disfluencies because it's mimicking human language. But
Mm-hmm.
those disfluencies are not indicative of any stalling on the machine's part. They're just mimicking what humans would do in that situation. So it's, in a sense, a false kind of message.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be really curious to know
Mm-hmm.
whether these cues, once they are no longer informative uh,
Yes.
about what's happening internally to the speaker, do we stop paying attention to them?
Mm-hmm.
That's one very small example of how technology may kind of shape how we
Mm-hmm.
interact with language, how we use language. But I think there's tons and tons of questions for psycholinguistics to address.
Absolutely. I'll just say two very quick things. My second son is dysnomic and dysgraphic, and his dysnomia means he has, word retrieval issues. His first job was with Google as a salesman over the phone. I was horrified to think that he would be on the phone selling. In reality, he became the best, and it was just because of what you would say. His pauses led people to actually understand him more. So that's one thing. But I want to say very quickly, because I know our time is very sparse, but my real worry with chatbots or any of this is that it will cause a cessation of the development of the very processes of writing in particular
Yes.
that allow us to make the kinds of evaluations you're talking about. So without the formation, which is arduous, which is laborious, it is actually forming those circuits that we use to drive our thoughts into language. Without that long-term formation, will our very ability to evaluate
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
be lost?
Yeah, exactly. So we have two more questions and just a couple of minutes. Do you want to pick one?
No, only because I want you to have the last 4 minutes. Julie, I have to drop at 3:30 for a PhD thesis. But
Yes.
Julie, it was such a pleasure. And I thank Planet Word and everyone for it. So I will listen to you, and at 3:30, you can continue, and I will help another PhD emerge in the world.
Okay, so I'll address there's a question about immigrants with young children. When will the shared family experience of coping with a new language draw the young and old together? And when will it pull those generations
Mm,
within the family apart? That too really sits close to my heart,
mhm,
um, because I think the frequent answer is that there is a schism in families by
mhm,
language that often occurs. I experienced it in my own family, where knowing that English was the valued language, that's what we kids gravitated towards and away from our mother tongue of Czech. Our parents, learning that language as adults, never had the facility that we did.
mhm,
And so there was a sense in which there were some things that were difficult to communicate about,
mhm,
because they didn't have the facility in English and we no longer had the facility in Czech.
mhm,
I think it really um, takes just, I think the answer will be different for every family of immigrants, but know that this is something that is just ubiquitous as an experience. So many families struggle with this
mhm,
and need to find ways to maintain those family bonds in the face of the generations really being pulled in different directions with respect to language.
mhm.
I really wish we had more support in North America for the maintenance of heritage languages. I think there's some recognition that that is actually not just about maintaining multilingualism, but about maintaining strong family bonds as well. And I think that whatever means you have at your disposal to access those resources, I would lean very heavily into those. And
Mhm.
I think our time is up, sadly.
Mm. Well, I will just say goodbye in as many languages as I can.
All right, let's hear them.
Well,
Well, let's begin. Auf Wiedersehen, au revoir, ciao, ciao, annyeonghaseyo, bye-bye.
and
Nice.
on behalf
Adieu,
of Brett,
adieu.
I'm going to jump in
All
just
of
to
these.
thank you both so much for this wonderful program. I think we've all enjoyed it. So everyone, please join me in thanking Julie and Maryanne. And please don't forget, if you haven't already, to get your copy of Linguaphile, A Life of Language Love, and subscribe to Planet Word's newsletter, which you can do at planetwordmuseum.org. Thank you, everybody, so much, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Brett. Thank
Marianne.
you, everybody.